Did you know that in Britain it was actually illegal to be a witch? And not just illegal, but for a witch to cast a spell on someone could land them in prison for up to 5 years. And if they were found guilty of calling themselves a witch, well, they could go to jail for 2 years. That is wild. So, why was Britain so worried about witches? Let's find out. Now, when we think of witches today, we think of a certain iconic film franchise. We might even visit a theme park or two based on them. In fact, there are plenty of people who celebrate their love of all things witchy through fashion, social media, etc. But it wasn't this way in the early 18th century. Back then, the idea of witchcraft was taken very seriously indeed. And in 1735, Parliament passed the Witchcraft Act, which made it a crime to pretend to have magical powers. This may sound like a law that's straight out of a dystopian novel, but at the time it was meant to protect people from those who claimed to be witches. Now, before we get into the details of this bizarre law, let's take a moment to talk about how we got here. Throughout history, there have been many instances of people being accused of witchcraft, often based on little more than fear, superstition, and prejudice. During the Salem witch trials in the United States, for example, more than 200 people were accused of witchcraft and 20 of them were executed. In England, the fear of witchcraft was particularly high during the 17th century. At this time, there was a lot of social and political upheaval, and people were looking for someone to blame for their troubles. Enter the witch craze. Many people began to believe that witches were everywhere and that they were conspiring to cause harm. This led to the passage of the Witchcraft Act of 1735, which made it a crime to pretend to have magical powers. The law specifically targeted those who pretended to be able to control the weather, cause harm to others through spells or curses, or communicate with the dead. These were seen as particularly dangerous forms of witchcraft, and those who practiced them were at risk of being accused of conspiring against the government. But why would someone want to mess with the government in this way? Well, the answer lies in the murky world of 18th century politics. At the time, the government was becoming increasingly powerful, and people were starting to push back. The Witchcraft Act was seen as a way to control the narrative and prevent people from using magic to challenge the authority of the state. Now, you might be wondering, what kind of magic were we talking about here? After all, we don't live in a world where magic is real. Well, the answer is folk magic. This is a form of magic that's based on superstition and folklore rather than on scientific principles. Folk magic was very popular in the 18th century, and people used it for a variety of purposes, from curing illness to protecting crops. It was also used to harm people and cause chaos, which is why the government was so eager to crack down on it. The Witchcraft Act of 1735 was repealed in 1951, largely because by that point nobody really believed in witches anymore. By the 20th century, the fear of witchcraft had largely subsided, and people were starting to embrace the supernatural as a form of entertainment. So finally, after hundreds of years of fear and persecution, witches were free to practice their craft without the threat of imprisonment hanging over their heads. But the legacy of the Witchcraft Act lives on in our language and culture. To this day, we use phrases like, "Don't be a chicken little," and "Beware of witches," to warn people about the dangers of believing everything they hear. Today, we look back at the Witchcraft Act of 1735 as a dark chapter in history. It was a time when fear and superstition ruled and innocent people were persecuted for their beliefs. But it's also a reminder of how far we've come as a society and how important it is to protect freedom of religion and belief for all people. Thanks for watching. When you think of the Salem witch trials, what do you think? Let me know in the comments.